Hey, welcome to another episode of Tell Me How You're Mighty, Infidelity Survival Stories. It's Tracy and Sarah here. Our guest today is Reverend David Derksen, who you might know from his blog, Divorce Minister. And today we're going to talk with him about spiritual abuse. It's hard to leave a cheater, and it's even harder if you're part of a faith community that doesn't support divorce. David's a unique voice in this space. He's a former chump, an ordained minister, a prison chaplain, and he's a graduate of Yale Divinity School. Welcome, David. Can you tell us a bit about your chump story and how you came to become divorce minister?
Sure. My chump story begins around 2011, 2012. My first spouse was a licensed marriage and family therapist.
Oh my.
And it was delightful. At least for a year prior to the divorce, there was at least one, actually multiple emotional affairs, which me being the chump that I am, took the responsibility for, of course, because it was a symptom of marriage problems as opposed to a symptom of bad character.
Yeah.
And eventually it escalated to a physical affair, and we got divorced in the end of 2012. And after that, because of the denomination I was with, I had to go through an ecclesiastical process, a trial, essentially.
You have to go through a trial?
Mm-hmm. I had to go through a trial to keep my license as a minister for this denomination, because they wouldn't license or credential anyone who was divorced unless they went through this process. So I went through this process about 4 months afterwards, and it included affidavits, evidence submitted, and then almost 3-hour fact-finding
This is just for you. So your unfaithful wife doesn't have to do it?
Well, this is what I was thinking. I'm just wondering whether she had to go through a similar process, given that she was a family therapist, and maybe she'd equally have had to prove herself.
As long as she doesn't sleep with her clients, she can sleep with whoever she wants based on the ethics of that organization. Unfortunately, which most people do not know, which is a good information for people to know. Your therapist could be a cheater and still be in good standing. So just FYI.
Yeah. So, but the chumped person here, your whole business is like on trial.
Exactly. Like, I was fighting for my credential, and one of the really awful things, there's a lot of awful things about that trial, was that they invited her to basically slander my name without me ever seeing what she wrote. So it's like, tell us what went wrong. And so
Why you had to cheat
she
on
wrote
him?
that, and yeah, why you basically had to cheat on him and discard him, essentially. I'm like, thanks, guys.
Wow.
But
did you have to wait during this process then for some sort of dramatic pronouncement saying, no, it's all right, it wasn't your fault, you can carry on? I mean, that must have been a horrible time in your life, not knowing what the outcome was going to be.
It was, and it was unfortunately, I was doing a residency, so I didn't have to have the credential fully at that point. But I would if I wanted to proceed after that. So that's why it was really critical for me to get through it. And that was part of my problem. The waiting was part of my problem with one of the officials who just didn't seem to care enough to let me know as soon as it was decided. Let's just put it that way.
It kind of gets to the crux of the matter of divorce minister is that you're on trial for getting divorced, but infidelity, which like is in the 10 Commandments, is something you're not supposed to do, seems to be not the greater sin here. Divorce is the sin, and cheating is not the sin. And that just seems really back-asswards. Like, I don't
Oh yeah,
get that.
yeah. And eventually they said they granted me an exception based on her adultery. And then unfortunately they decided to tack on a year of pastoral care, which this official interpreted as disciplinary essentially. It was essentially a PIP that was written for me of we'll judge how well you're healing, we'll vote on your credentials after a year and all that. I'm like, and then they gaslit me about it. I'm like, dude, that's a disciplinary. Like, I know I can read and I'm not stupid, but oh
Wow.
no, this is care. We're just caring for you. I'm like, no, you're not.
The right thing to do would be to stay in a marriage where someone's cheating on you. That's the only thing you could have done to avoid this process, which is ridiculous.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of sick problems with the process, and um, part of the reason I share this is that out of this process, it became painfully obvious how ill-equipped other pastors are to handle these situations. I remember sitting through this fact-finding, if you want to call it that, committee
Mhm.
for almost 3 hours, and I had to explain to them why, uh, if if they were taking testimony from my ex, that it probably is not an unbiased, truthful testimony. I'm like, how do you guys make it to be about the age of my parents and not understand this very basic dynamic? Um, why would I ever have to explain that to a bunch of seasoned pastors who clearly are naive to these matters? Um, I had a journal entry from her about that was a mind map, leaving out different options to do with another other man.
Mhm.
So there was a minimally three other men, couple emotional affairs minimally, and one confirmed adulterous affair. And this other person, she had listed out different ways to handle the relationship, including a full blown affair. And she always feels good to be able to make a decision about this, like have a say a decision about this. And this executive pastor is like, well, why would she write that out there? Like totally missing the forest for the trees. And like she clearly is already having an emotional affair if she's thinking about a full
Yeah.
blown affair
You
with
need to
this man.
explain the pick me dance to him. Like, she's just
Exactly.
surveying the options here.
Yes.
Like you are just one of many options on the menu. And
Yeah.
to me, like, I can't get over that you're having to be on trial and that all this intimate um,
Oh,
information is any business of the churches. I mean, I could see if you were the person cheating,
mhm.
if it was some abuse of
Yeah.
power, if it was a parishioner that you were cheating with. I mean,
Yep.
I'm not saying that disciplinary actions or bringing this stuff up is wrong, but it, like I said,
Agreed.
it's back assward. You're the victim here of
Yep.
someone else's cheating, and you have to defend yourself to this denomination.
If you felt on trial, it demonstrates a huge lack of empathy in that if one of part of this community had been going through marriage problems or their partner was cheating on them and they
Mhm.
knew what you'd gone through, they're not going to feel in any sort of position to seek out help, which surely is
No.
what a religious community is all about, being able to discuss
Yeah.
things and ask for help and ask for advice.
And that's probably the saddest thing about it is that, like, if this is how you treat your brother and ministers, it's certainly going to be worse for those who are in the pews,
Yeah.
because that permeates through the whole system. And one thing that was very ironic about it is that they're, as ministers, you're supposed to read certain literature to be fully ordained with them. And part of the literature, they acknowledged that they had divorce prejudice. And I'm sitting with this man who gave me the PIP, essentially, explained to him, hey, so what do you mean by this? We're not supposed to have divorce prejudice. And he couldn't see it. Like, he
Hmm.
literally told me that basically I should just shut up and be thankful they left me with my credential, because if it was up to him and I was a local pastor, he'd remove me from the pulpit for this.
I hope you removed yourself. Did you leave this denomination?
I did. I
Yeah.
left. It wasn't just for that. There's some theological things that like I'm no longer aligned with this denomination as well, and so I left. I'm still under the umbrella of the National Association of Evangelicals, but I found a Lutheran denomination that was a lot more full of grace and care. And that's where I'm at today. So it's for my
And you're in
career choice.
Minnesota, so a lot of Lutherans up there.
Yep. A few of us, you swing a cat, you'll find them Lutheran.
Oh man. So how did you become divorce minister? I mean, you just realized that there was a need for this discussion, that other people were suffering in
Yeah.
a similar way.
So that's a big part of it. I saw there was a need for it. I started it actually as just a cheap blog spot, and then I was
Mhm.
seeing a lot of reaction, and then within a couple of days, with the support of Aubrey, my wife, and I created this space and launched it in July of 14. And it's just taken off since then.
So let's mention
Um,
Aubrey for a minute. So you moved on from this terrible experience and met a wonderful woman, and
mhm,
you're a dad. And can you tell us a little bit about
mhm.
that? You totally rebuilt your life. You left the bad
Yeah.
church. And,
Oh yeah. It was so. Um, I finished my year of residency at the Veteran Affairs Medical Center in St. Cloud, Minnesota, as a chaplain, and I met Aubrey in the August of 13, just before that internship finished. Um, we we met through an online dating app. I kind of decided that I wanted to use some sort of vetting system. At least this app had some vetting,
Mhm.
because clearly my last go around didn't go so well. Um, and so we met, and um, she she already she already had my ring like three months, I think it was. 1 month, she says. One
Aw.
month into our dating relationship, and then I proposed 1 year, little over 1 year after my divorce was finalized, and we got married in March of 14 when I got my full time job in hospice, um, and then we moved to the Twin Cities area and started our life together. Nalene was almost 3 years old at the time, so she's coming up on 13. Um,
Coming up on
and we
10-year
became a
anniversary.
family.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, she hasn't
It's a
killed me
totally
yet.
different thing to have a good partner, isn't it?
It is. It's day and night difference.
It strikes me how incredibly well you did though, in that there was no messing around. Your ex-wife cheats, you
Yeah.
you get on with it, you get the divorce, you pick yourself up, and it's with so many of us don't do that. You know, you kind of try and, as Tracy says, do the pick me dance, and it seems like as you pick yourself up, they were trying to knock you down again.
Oh, that's. I'm only giving you the Cliff Notes version of the story. I probably would have stayed married to her because I was so chumpy, and because of how high the costs were to me for my
Mhm.
career. But God in His mercy allowed this whole thing to go through. Like like I said, I took the blame for her emotional affairs. And I allowed, and the crazy thing too is these Christian counselors we went to, she would even confess the emotional affair, and they'd quickly change subjects and come after me. And just sort of, I look back in that and I'm like, wow, this was so butt backwards.
Yeah, so
Um,
it's abusive. I mean, I think it's victim
it
blaming.
was.
I mean, it's not
Yep.
just church counselors. I mean, there's a lot of that in
Oh
regular
yeah,
therapy too. The whole,
absolutely.
dual accountability and unmet needs, and
Yep. Takes
essentially
two
you
to
drove them.
tango. Yeah.
Yeah, you
Mhm.
make people cheat on you.
It does
Yeah.
Yeah.
remind me a little bit of what my ex-husband said to me when I finally served him with divorce papers.
Hmm.
He cheating extensively, and we'd played all sorts of games where he said he wasn't with the other woman, then he still was, and eventually I had enough, and
Yeah.
I went in with the divorce papers, and he burst into tears, and he said, you're breaking your marriage vows. He says it's supposed to be for better or for worse. And conveniently forgetting the cheating element of
Taking all
things.
of
So I
this,
think
yeah.
people can be quite good at that, sort of picking and
Yes.
choosing which of the vows they would like to stick to.
Yeah, it's very true.
But it sounds like the church does that too, though. I mean, it's kind of picking and choosing which things it's going to take offense at. And
Yeah,
while I'm not, I'm a very lapsed Methodist, but it seems like you give a lot of comfort to people because you give them
yeah,
faith-based reasons for why divorce is okay, and that a loving
yes,
God would not keep you in an abusive
yeah,
marriage. And it's kind of
absolutely.
you're giving people permission to leave. People with a more
Yeah,
secular background struggle with this, but I imagine it's even deeper for people to divorce not only their unfaithful partner, but to divorce their church, which is you pretty much had to go through the two divorces.
yeah. It was it was really painful in a lot of ways. I'm a very loyal person, and so it, I oftentimes stay in relationships much longer than it's good for me to stay. That was I guess, a learning experience in this whole thing. And at the same time, when it comes to like the community, I don't think it's just those who are connected to churches. I think in general, it's when divorce happens, and that's one of the big misnomers about infidelity is that it's not a private thing. Like
Hmm.
it blows up a marriage, and so many people are hurt. You lose so many people you thought were friends who turn out not to be friends. And the supports you thought were going to be there aren't there. And then you find that there's support that you never knew that come out of the woodwork too. So there is some beauty even in the midst of the carnage. At least that's what I found.
And that also the people knew about it in a lot of cases, but you were the last to know. So in that sense, it's not a private matter.
Not at all. No. And for those who come to the website, a lot of what my hope and my prayer with this work is that they don't have to lose their relationship with God over this, because my opinion, what's going on is their religion, just like in my experience, was weaponized against me,
Hmm.
and so hoping to be a voice of reason to separate what humans are doing with religion from um, the image of who I believe is a very loving and just God who does see us as victims and is angry for us enduring abuse, and does care about what we're going through. And to kind of convey that and show that through the text is one of my passions
Hmm.
from all this. It's kind of the blog in a lot of ways is in the 12-step community is my 12th step, my way to give back to the community. It's one way to put it as well.
Can you tell us a little bit about the stories of what kind of people seek solace at your blog? I mean, they're not perhaps being on trial like you are, but are you getting
Mhm.
similar stories from their faith communities that they're being in trouble for divorcing, or they're getting messages to stay?
Some of the more heartbreaking stories that I've gotten over the years and people I've talked with are men who are in ministry whose wives have cheated on them,
Mm,
and the horrific stories are they got it worse than I did, where their churches just turn on them and fire them over it, sort of things.
wow.
And it's just truly utterly horrific. Um, and situations like that are unfortunately not uncommon. I can think of at least two offhand, um, of those that I've spoken with personally over the years with this blog. Um, Another one as well that had to leave because of all of it as well. So not just sinister ministers, but it's also faithful spouses, chums who end up bearing the cost
Yeah,
unjustly.
sure. And for men too, I think, you bring up a good point. I think that betrayed, I've said this a lot about my blog back when I could
Mhm,
get into the Google Analytics of it, that it's like a third to a half of the readership are men, but they lurk.
mhm.
And
Yes.
whereas women are more vocal about, straight women, I should say, are more vocal about talking about it, older straight women, and it's not necessarily the largest demographic of readers, but the
Yeah.
least vocal are men, even though statistically they've got to get chumped, almost as often as women are. But
Yeah.
there's such a taboo around it. And I wonder if you
Yeah.
if you could talk a bit, I mean, not just other fellow pastors, but to men,
Yeah.
have you been able to talk to other guys about it?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think that, and that's not just online, but offline too. Um, I don't know if you've experienced this phenomenon, but because I talk about this stuff or post on my social media, sometimes friends that I've known for years, all of a sudden, out of the woodwork reach out to me. And I'm like, oh no,
Oh yeah,
oh no. Yeah, because that usually means that they need to talk with someone about these situations,
yeah,
which I'm more than happy to do to support them.
yeah.
Um,
Sarah,
but
does that
yeah, no,
happen to you? Do people know that you've been chumped, and so now you're like the go-to divorce person?
Sometimes, yeah, sometimes, but initially it's the defining thing about you, isn't it? And then it kind of fades into the background, really. So it isn't the thing that people know. I don't tend to talk about it, an
mhm,
awful lot now. But I do have a lot of people that come to me who are in marriages that maybe aren't the happiest and would like to get out but don't get out and stay in. There are lots of reasons beyond religion that people stay in a marriage that they shouldn't be. There's a lot keeping people together when maybe life is so precious that you need to enjoy every bit of it, and that doesn't involve staying in a dysfunctional relationship, whatever the reasons for it, even if it's hard to leave.
Hmm. I mean, I think there's still a lot of shame about leaving. I mean, I know I got
right,
that, as a young single mom getting divorced, and I was in an untenable situation. And, instead of being, getting compassion for that untenable situation, you get a lot of, oh, my Paul reminded me of this, and it's somewhere in the recesses of my head why I should ever forget it. But my grandmother said to me, she goes, "You'll die alone." She goes, "You'll die
mhm,
alone. You can't ever expect another man to love your child." Oh, I'm like 34 years old. My son's father
mhm,
had mental illness and wasn't treating it. Like I said, it was an untenable situation. And I'm like,
right,
oh, yep, that's it. I'm done. No one will ever love me again. That's right. I'm all washed up. And I'm sure for her generation, that probably sadly was true a lot of the time. But still, I mean, like, what an awful thing to say. I think people carry those messages around with them and they internalize it. And like Sarah says, they're afraid to go. Or it just piles on. It's just, it's hard enough to make the decision to act in your best interest. It's a whole other thing when you get these cultural and spiritual messages telling you that you're damaged goods, which
yeah,
just doesn't seem like something, a compassionate community or a God would think about you. Because it depends on what kind of God you believe in.
yeah. Yeah, as I talked at Chumpalooza, there's an element of moral injury that takes place around this. That if you've internalized the message that divorce is never acceptable, and then you get divorced, you got to figure out what do you do with that reality. How do I relate to God if I've broken something that I thought God told me not to do? And then you have all that shame, all that guilt, and then you have the community ostracizing of you. So there's a high cost around the divorce itself. That's more than just the trauma around it. It's more than even the grief around it. It's a how do I make meaning of this? because we're meaning-making creatures. And so my hope in a lot of ways is my website, in a lot of ways I would argue is a way to try to treat that moral injury, to put language and come back to a new normal, so that when we read the classic verse out of Malachi 2:16, I hate divorce, says God, you understand that he's not saying that divorce is what's the problem. What he's saying is the use of divorce to cheat is the problem. And helping people understand the larger context, so that when they hear that, they know, well, someone's never really bothered to actually look at the full context of this verse. They just grabbed a verse and then made it more important than the Ten Commandments, essentially.
So really, the focus should be on the person that's caused the divorce, which is the cheater, as opposed to the
Yes.
innocent party, which seems so logical and obvious, but it really wasn't in your case, and you had to go through all that.
Yeah.
Forgiveness is a big part of faith as well. Have you been able to forgive those people that treated you like that?
Yeah, I have. It's a tricky concept, forgiveness, and it's often abused and twisted. When I think of forgiveness, I think that there's an element that forgiveness is, in some sense, it's unilateral, but in another sense, it's not. Um, there's a scripture that Jesus says, if your brother sins against you, rebuke him, and if he repents, forgive him. So there's an element of response that needs to take place. And even a lot of the parables about forgiveness, there's an important element that's not usually at work in a lot of these situations, which is the debt is already acknowledged and assumed. So one of the problems in a lot of these situations is that we have cheaters who will die and never acknowledge they did something wrong. Period. End of story. So there's a limit to how far forgiveness can go in those situations. So when I think of forgiveness in those situations, it's more of, I'm not going to carry the anger around it anymore. That doesn't mean that I don't think it's wrong. I always think that it's wrong. But I'm not going to be the punisher, if you will. Like,
Yeah, you
you know what,
reject
I'm going to give
revenge, right?
Exactly. That's pretty much what it is. I'm like, okay, God, this is too heavy for me to handle. I'm just going to give this over to you. And so in that sense, yeah, it's up to him. But there's other elements of I'm worried about those who will experience it again, with some of these larger issues not addressed, like say with the denomination.
I think the forgiveness thing is such a big issue, and I see this again, not just in religious communities or people that come to me, but in the larger discourse, that when you discuss something as vulnerable as being cheated on, the knee-jerk reaction is, well, did you forgive them? Are you going to be friends with your ex? And you're not bitter, are you? You can't be bitter. You can't be angry, and you can't be bitter, and you can't be mad about this. It immediately pivots to the singular mistake and your inability to forgive that singular mistake that they, as you rightly point out, that they don't think is a mistake, or that they're not sorry about, or haven't asked your forgiveness for. But immediately the emphasis is on the injured party to confer forgiveness. And that does seem abusive. It seems victim blaming.
Well, it is a form of spiritual abuse, because you're using a religious concept to use power over. Instead of it being freeing, it causes more suffering. And one thing I see, a very common error in helping people in these situations within the Christian tradition, is that there's a deprioritization of the grief process over the forgiveness process, because both are processes, especially for a deep wound. Like, you're not going to get to a place where most people will not be able to say, well, I can just this is no longer bothering me, what was done to me, if it's a really deep betrayal, like infidelity is. But grief says, like, I have to see this, I have to name it, I have to acknowledge that it happened, that I lost something, and it was awful.
Yeah.
And go through that new normal light of it. That it's and that's a lot of what brings healing is bearing witness to what happened and acknowledging that it happened. And a lot of the religious people, they don't want to talk about it because it's really uncomfortable to actually
Yeah,
talk
in that
about
way,
these
I think
things.
forgiveness is like spackle. It's like we're not going to talk about it.
Exactly.
We're not going to go talk about your vulnerability. That makes me very uncomfortable.
Mhm.
Let's everybody feel good again. Like I forgive you.
Yeah,
Happy, happy.
yeah,
And yeah, it's such a whiplash for the person who has been injured. And also I think it's another way to beat yourself up or to feel like you failed or you didn't measure up. It's like I don't I don't have the right to my anger and grief, and I have to be
mhm,
a bigger, better person, and it's so hard. I mean, I hear those messages a lot in the community.
oh yeah. Well,
There's a big
it kind
irony
of
here as well that you went through what you went through, sort of being judged and being challenged, and you know all the evidence sifted through to see why your marriage had ended up in divorce. Because I sense that you tried really hard. You did everything you could to save that marriage. You didn't want to get divorced, and yet you were being harangued because of that. What was the final turning? It must have been really difficult because you must have known that there were going to be these consequences on top of the pain of a divorce. What was the final point in your marriage where you knew that divorce was the only way forward for you?
uh well, I found out after I flew out to Minnesota and did an interview for the chaplaincy residency in August. Came back, and at that point, my now ex was not living at home at our condo, and I came back to the condo, and she had taken out her birth control. I'll put it that way, and left like her grandmother's jewelry and all that still in the residency. So I knew something was up. And then I just learned of the other man as well around almost that same week, I think it was. So it's pretty obvious something was going on. Um, and so I wrote her a letter and basically gave her the choice of you can either end this relationship and convince me that there's no others, or we're done. Like, I'm not going to be your friend.
Yeah.
I'm not looking for a woman who's a friend. I'm looking for a wife. And we'll just be done. And I basically got you can take your friendship and shove it response uh, on her. And then I went silent mostly for almost a month. And then she reaches out and goes like, "Well, you're so abusive because you haven't been talking with me." So it's classic borderline behavior
You're so
on
awful.
my
I need more of you.
exact. Yeah, it was terrible. And like, I think one of my classic mistakes is that I allowed myself to be convinced to jump off of focusing on the infidelity. Um, but that's what chumps do. Like I was trying to stay together and hoping up till the end. Um, I probably wouldn't have gotten a divorce if she hadn't pushed it through. But I think
Yeah.
she knew that, so that's why she pushed it through.
Well, that's where like God works in mysterious ways. Thank God that prayer wasn't
Yeah,
answered, you know? Like you
thank
got a
God it was a
much
mercy,
better life and a
huge
much better
mercy.
partner, you know? And yeah,
Absolutely.
it's kind of, but
Absolutely.
you know, it takes a lot of bravery. I kind of want to circle back to
Yeah.
the space that you create with your blog and what's
Yeah.
lacking in the discourse, and that's the sense of having a safe space. And and I think that's what's so insidious about spiritual abuse is that you expect that
Yeah.
in these really difficult times, you know, even for people who don't have a faith, but you would think, you know, weddings, funerals, sicknesses, you know, that's when you're going to have a guy with a collar or a woman with a collar show up at your event. That's when you're going to have these spiritual moments, and you would think
Yeah.
that something like this traumatic is that this
Yeah.
community would be safe, and that it's a harbor, and that when these people, when you're turned against, and you're in this very vulnerable place, to get kicked again is so awful. Yeah, I think a lot of people don't rise above it. I think a lot of people stay stuck. And it's really to your credit that you
Yeah.
didn't stay stuck, that, like Sarah said, you got out. And it's great that
Yeah.
you're helping other people get out.
Yeah. That is my hope. And there's just a lot of perverse incentives with pastors in these situations. Who wants to be the pastor that's presided over a lot of divorces, as opposed to the pastor
Yeah.
that saved 20 marriages this last year, sort of bragging. And like, it's just very sick. And even well-meaning pastors they don't understand it. They really don't. And so they end up with some sort of inherited view of these things. And oftentimes it's inherited from a very sick counseling culture. And you get this whole, like, well, it takes, like I said, the whole euphemisms of it takes two to tango, and I have to hear both sides. I'm like, no, actually, it's abuse. You
Yeah.
don't need to hear both sides.
Yeah.
And that still hasn't gotten through to them. And that's one of the big things of one of the concepts that I developed on my website, was that adultery is soul rape, because I base it off of scripture that we're one in spirit. And so when that oneness is violated against our will, it's that sort of violation. And that's why it's, quite frankly, so traumatic and so a deep level, like having your heart ripped out with a spoon. Is because there's a spiritual reality there going on. And I think it's helpful for someone who's never experienced to understand, yeah, it's that extreme. It's that horrible. So it makes it even worse when you start blaming that person for being traumatized in that way.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And it also helps explain why men are more reticent to talk about it, because who wants to cop to being violated like that?
Yeah. I think it's hard for everybody to talk about. Well, I was going to pivot to a slightly snarkier take. Sarah and I have a little thing we call Fuckwit of the Week. And we were wondering if you would, we ask our guests to react to the Fuckwit of the Week. This one comes from the blog post where people wrote in. So
they're shameless, unreliable, and gobsmackingly entitled. It's Fuckwit of the Week.
When he told me on D-Day that he had a plan he'd been devising, he said he'd tried hookers, and that wasn't enough. So he went to sex clubs, and that wasn't enough. So he had to have a girlfriend because it was becoming inconvenient and unsafe for him to have random hookups. It was better for everyone, he said, that he did his cheating with one woman.
Oh, that's a fuckwit!
Wow, what do you think? We're speechless, huh? He's thinking of everybody. It's what's best for everybody, because, it's unsafe to go to sex clubs and sex workers. So he's sacrificing, really. He's just down to one.
He's condensing all his cheating into one area, to one woman. And this is both unflattering to all concerned. So the other woman was a lot of sex workers all condensed into one. How joyful. I wonder whether he told her that.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, you're the very special anointed one.
I wonder how long that will last, too, considering his history.
Oh, no.
It's best for everyone until I grow tired of it.
Well, right. Likely. And, and they're lying liars who lie. So just because he said he gave up his hooker habit doesn't mean that he really did. But But really, it's his way of sort of being benevolent. Look at me cutting back.
Yes.
I'm down to one. I'm down to one. I mean,
The
what do you think
interesting
about
lies
the
that tell.
entitlement of it's best for everyone? I mean, do you find that's talk about spiritual abuse? Is sort of this narcissism that whatever I want is good for, all you
Yes.
extensions of me?
Yeah, I had a moment of that with my cheater where she copped to sleeping with this guy, and then she's like, "I'm not divorcing you because of that." I'm like, "What?" Like, so big of you. Like, wow, how entitled can you be?
Right. I think that's also is like, but you're the one I come home to, right? You're the special one.
Exactly.
Wow.
Mhm.
Can you
You should
relate
feel
to
very
any of
Also,
this?
and it also highlights the fact that, okay, if that's what's going on in your head, that you're doing this for the benefit of everybody else concerned, then it might
Yep.
be quite nice to tell them ahead of your plans exactly what you're doing and see how reasonable they find that before you actually commit yourself to doing it.
Well, that's true. But think of all the money he's saving, Sarah. He's not seeing the hookers anymore. So there's a cost benefit analysis here. What's the girlfriend cost? The occasional steak dinner? I don't know. The Motel 6? I don't,
He can narrow down the STI to one individual instead of spreading it among many.
Well, there's that, right? You can't make sense of it because it just
Crazy.
doesn't make any sense, right? It's just, which is why we make fun of them. Well, David, tell us where we can find you, where everyone can find your work.
Yeah, the blog is divorceminister.com, and I have a book out on Amazon. It's called Cheated On by David Derksen. Yeah, it's more or less a long form version of the blog. Ideas expanded a bit. And those are the main ways to find me.
Thank you. Thank you so much for doing this. That wraps another episode of Tell Me How You're Mighty. You want to leave us a mighty story or a fuckwit of the week submission? Check out our new website, tellmehowyourmighty.com. That's yours spelt YOURE. We've got all the episodes, show notes, links to our guests, and you can see the tea room where Sarah and I first met. If you enjoyed this episode, please review the podcast and follow us. Thanks. See you next week.